Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us here today, and those of you that are joining online or streaming from around the country and hopefully around the world. My name is David Cofield. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Humanity Forward, and we are here today hosting our second iteration of our policy discussion with the Bipartisan Policy Center on blockchain and cryptocurrency. Appreciate everyone's active engagement and support of all the organizations and our panelists here today. I encourage folks that are active on social media to hashtag BPC Live. You can follow along and also interact with our Twitter handles at BPC_bipartisan, as well as at Humanity Forward. Before we get started, I would also like to thank Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting and providing a positive platform and productive and pragmatic policy opportunity for us to have this conversation today. Also like to thank and introduce our panelists and their organizations, Healthy Markets, Sawdust Labs, and also AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. We're excited to host this co-host this event today and hear from our thought leaders on these important topics and questions regarding regulation of cryptocurrencies and the future of this growing industry. At Humanity Forward, we strongly believe in this emerging technology and the way that it can provide and expand on social economic benefits to communities and families across the country, and the ways that we can help the American economy be stronger. The discussion today is also in part of this, and we encourage all of our panelists and participants to think about the best ways to achieve durable and bipartisan solutions as we work through this topic. And to that end, I'd like to introduce and thank John Sarushian, who is a senior associate here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, specializing in business and technology. Previously, John was at the Brookings Institute and also the Treasury Department. I'll let John introduce the rest of our panelists, but we should have a great conversation here today and appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, John.
Great. Thank you, David. So as David said, I'm John Sarushian. I'm the Senior Associate Director of Business and Technology. I just want to thank Humanity Forward and David for partnering with us for a series of events here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So our first event was a couple months ago on the opportunities and challenges in the crypto space and debates around them. This event will focus on regulatory architecture questions. We have an amazing group of panelists speaking with us, so let me just quickly introduce them. Kathy Kraninger, to my immediate left, is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Solidus Labs, and she was the former Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Next to her is Tyler Galash. He's the President and CEO of Healthy Markets. And to his left is Paul Kupiec. He is a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you all for joining us. And for those watching us online, you can submit, we're gonna have questions at the end of this event or towards the end of the event. You can submit them either using the chat function on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. And for people here in person in the audience, when we get to Q&A, you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you for the Q&A portion. So with that, first question is for you, Paul. A few weeks ago, you gave a speech sort of introducing many of the regulatory architecture issues and policy issues in the crypto space. I thought you did a great job with that speech. We don't have time for the full speech, but do you want to give a sort of condensed version of crypto policy issues and the regulatory architecture as it exists today and the questions being debated?
Okay, thank you, John. I'll do my best. Thanks for inviting me. The crypto world, or the world of tokenized finance, includes lots of different products and services. By tokenized finance, typically we mean things that trade over a distributed ledger blockchain or some payments and settlement system, something like a distributed ledger. There's many variations of this now as we move through time. The original one, of course, was Bitcoin, but we've moved on to different versions of a distributed ledger. And probably will continue to innovate in the future. But the regulation for tokenized finance is complicated, in part because right now, the tokenized finance products have to fit into the regulations for legacy financial products and services, and those regulations are very complex. There are thousands of pages of regulation. There's pages and pages of court cases. All kinds of things to cover here. There's at least 6 federal agencies involved in it, 50 state regulatory agencies, and not to mention at least 2 committees in Congress. And all of these different political operatives have their own interests in mind when they try to come at this problem. So right now, the simplest kinds of what I think of as the simplest kinds of tokenized finance would be stablecoins, US dollar stablecoins in particular, those backed by high quality reserve assets. There are also algorithmic stablecoins, which are much more complicated. But those traditionally right now, they are actually regulated, and a lot of them are registered as money transfer agents with states, various states. In fact, they have to register with every state, which makes it a little problematic. You have to deal with all 50, and some people would like a federal license for that. But of course, there's debates about that, and bills have been introduced. So those are the kind of most straightforward. They fit in pretty well with what you might think, and even on those things which would seemingly be straightforward, we've got no consensus on that. Just last there are 2 cryptocurrencies which aren't stable coins, which have been treated as commodities thus far, although last Friday we heard out of the SEC Chairman Gary Gensler that he was reconsidering, I think, his ideas on that and might try to claim that at least one of them is a security, and I would imagine that would be Ether and the Ethereum network. But when it comes to that, there are many things considered securities that are tokenized finance, and they're subject to SEC regulation. And this has probably been the most debated, contentious part. For things to be securities, they have to be a common enterprise. They have to offer you have to make an investment of money. There has to be an expectation of profit, and it's a pretty wide sort of criteria. And lots of tokens, the SEC would argue, I think, fall under this rubric of securities, although the SEC hasn't to date actually made any rules that would particularly apply to tokenized products. So you don't really know if a product is a security or not, according to the SEC. We're finding it out only when the SEC decides to bring some sort of enforcement action and saying, oh, you're really violating our rules. So there's no real certainty there, and that's problematic. Moreover, if you're designated a security, there are lots of things you have to satisfy. One, you need a management. You need to have management disclosure about important things the management's doing for the company. You need financial statements. You need audited financial statements. You need to make disclosures. And for a particular class of tokenized financial products, the ones known as DeFi, many of these are just computer code that is written and developed by a group of people. But once the code is written and developed, it can be deployed on various blockchain and used and traded. And the blockchain may have nothing to do with the product, the DeFi product that's been registered. And so these kinds of products are problematic because if they have characteristics that are securities, they would have to meet all the rules and regulations about legacy security products, which means they'd have to have a management report and disclosure and accounting statements, and all they are is computer code. So there are a lot of sort of places where the current legacy approach to the way we manage banks and broker dealers and stock exchanges, they don't really work for some kinds of tokenized products. There's some kind of tokenized products that may fit in, but others not. And the way forward either is the tokenized products have to basically interact with all the regulatory agencies, all the states, to get rules put in place that clarify what they are and what kind of things they have to abide by, or there has to be legislation. And so far, there's been a number of attempts at different kinds of legislation this last year. I think there was last week just a new one supposedly leaked, and but none of them have been very successful so far. So there's been debate. There's a lot of lobbying going around by the industry, a lot of Washington talk, but nothing's really happened yet.
Thanks, Paul. And Tyler or Kathy, do you have anything to add to that, or should we move on to the next question?
I think we're going to cover in the next stuff.
Okay, that works. All right.
It's a deep rabbit hole here
Yes.
that Paul tried to introduce us to.
Yes. Paul can do it the most succinctly of anyone, but it's complicated.
It's complicated, very complicated.
Okay, so I'll turn to you, Kathy. So you were director of CFPB. After you left, you went to Solidus Labs, the place you currently work at. Where did you get to Solidus Labs? But why did you go to the crypto space as opposed to other areas of financial services? Was there anything specific that excited you or interested you or a certain challenge that you wanted to tackle?
Definitely. So my career, much of it was spent in government startups, frankly. I was at the Department of Transportation on September 11th and involved heavily in the U.S. government's response after that, obviously horrific events, but that led us to the creation of TSA, obviously the complete remaking of aviation security as we know it across the globe. And that led me to also be part of the stand-up of the Department of Homeland Security. And as you think about the government taking on cybersecurity and what the government's role was, the private sector's role, that really introduced me to a lot of dynamics around financial services. And so the opportunity to lead the CFPB was, again, another young agency with a mission that's still forming and a lot of things there to effectuate. And between the Hill and the executive branch, I loved my role in public policy and trying to think about and tackle these difficult issues and new areas of regulation. How should we go about it? What makes the most sense? Paul touched on some of the things with respect to the states' roles versus the federal government's roles. And that's certainly a very prime area in the space of crypto regulation. So that's what excited me about getting into financial innovation, and then specifically into really the possibilities around blockchain technology. And it's difficult because I think taking us back even from where Paul started, thinking about this as whether it's finance or technology. The digital asset markets are really the means to secure the blockchain and to really proliferate and grow the blockchain. And so that's been the first use case that we as consumers have seen. And that's the part that's also made it challenging, though, because it doesn't quite fit in the same box of financial regulation that exists today. And so, what are we talking about? Are we talking about, again, some creative engineers that think they have the next great idea in software that they want to release to the world? Well, again, is that a financial product? And what are the characteristics of that? So really, I love the issue space. Solidus Labs is a company that is building risk monitoring. So recognizing that these digital asset markets are out front, there are responsibilities. When you're engaging in supporting those that are trading, and you have an exchange business and you're pairing those who want to buy with those who want to sell, you have responsibilities in terms of creating that fair and transparent marketplace. So we're the software that actually underlies that and helps people monitor the activity that's happening in trading and transactions, certainly anti-money laundering, with other partners, including a few that are in the room here today, that really are thinking about what the future of monitoring looks like in the digital asset space. So that's what I've been really excited about at Solidus Labs and frankly, this space. I mean, we do get to a whole bunch of other use cases that are possible in this world that just aren't out there yet. So I guess the last thing I would do is take us to the beginning of at least those of us that are my age or older, when the internet was really touching, becoming part of our lives early in the 90s, and you had your first email address, and you did not contemplate beyond some of the real, internet entrepreneurs that we know today as household names. They're the ones that thought about all of the ways that the internet could be used. We just thought it was cool to be able to send a message across the world. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and it was my lifeline. But I literally carried my laptop to the internet service provider for an hour walk, downloaded and uploaded, and then walked home. And I did that every week. Totally different world than what we're talking about today. And blockchain takes you to even that greater level of what's possible.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Interesting times, to say the least. I'm going to turn it to Ty. So you have been on the more critical side of the crypto industry. You've had some statements that were a bit critical. What do you want to see? What are some of the issues you see in the crypto space? Before getting to solutions, let's talk about some of the issues you see in the crypto space that you think policymakers should address.
Well, I think we have to deal with it, think of it as an asset, right? We're talking about different types of assets. And so when you think about the assets, you think about what are the risks. And I apologize, Healthy Markets is an investor trade group. So large institutional investors and financial intermediaries. So one of the things that you start to think about is what are the risks of the asset itself? Like, you might think of it, if it's a stock, is this a good company or a bad company? Or if you think of it as a bank account, is it an insured depository or is it uninsured? Those are different types of things. And then you also think about what are the risks of the intermediary? What's the plumbing apparatus? So when we talk about digital assets, one of the things we're often talking about is the mismatch of, hey, what are the issuer disclosures, the people selling the product or who are part or behind the product, supporting the product? That's one set of risks. But the other things we think about is in the securities markets, for example, we say, hey, if you're an exchange that happens to touch one of those products, you now have to register with us. Here's how you have to operate. Here are the conflicts of interest that you have to manage. If you're a broker-dealer, you can't trade ahead of your customer. You can't jump in front of them. When you have to custody their assets, here are the safeguards we put in place so that when they entrust you with their money, it's still theirs when maybe you fall into trouble, you, the bank or broker-dealer or intermediary. And so one of the things I think we have to recognize is when we're talking about digital assets, we're not just talking about the regulatory apparatus for the asset itself. We're not just talking about the issuer, if you're in a security space, or the developer behind the product. We're also talking about all of the infrastructure parts around it. And so what's been interesting as a development, industry development, is essentially without sort of the assertion of regulatory apparatus, we've seen all of those services that in the securities and commodities markets have been segmented and regulated to manage those conflicts of interest. So you have an exchange that's subject to one set of rules, but they're not a broker. A broker has a totally different set of rules. And if you want to trade against your customer, you have an entirely new set of rules, and an asset manager who has a different set of rules. All of those things are compressed. So in the digital asset space, one of the things we have to recognize is it's not just the risk of the thing, but as we've learned from Celsius Network, it might be the risk of the intermediary. And as we learn from somebody else, it might be hacking risks, right? So banks and broker-dealers, you don't see $500 million hacks every couple of weeks, because there are lots of rules designed to protect investors. So it's not so much the assets that I worry about. It's what do the investors know about the risks of the thing they're buying, but also all of the places where that can break down and hurt them along the way.
Okay, so you're thinking broader than just the assets with the infrastructure exchanges. And Paul, you want to respond to that?
I'd like to pick up on this. So their first is what the industry calls the protocol, which is there's a blockchain. The blockchain is some system for transferring assets between parties and clearing and settle, and it keeps track of who owns what. It's a distributed ledger. It's something like that. The industry calls that a protocol. So there's that. And that's sort of a clearing and payment system. The banks have clearing and payment systems where they do their dollars. The tokenized has it's a new form, a new way to clear and pay transactions. That's one aspect. There are products then that you can trade on these new clearing and settlements. And the products may be a service. They may be something that looks like an investment where you put in money and you get something back. They may be something entirely different where you put in money and you own a piece of artwork for whatever reason. I don't understand those exactly why people do that, but they do. So, and then there are intermediate, the DeFi finance world likes to think of itself as distributed finance. No, there's nobody in charge. Everybody's in charge. Everybody works through the internet. You don't need an intermediary to transact. But that's really kind of misleading because all of tokenized finance has created their own intermediaries. We have exchanges. We have people that act like broker dealers. So there are aspects of it that very much mirror legacy finance that Todd says, hey, we have rules about that and we have them for a reason. We want to protect people's money and what they do. But there are new aspects of it, like the clearing and settlement system, the blockchain, that doesn't really work so well with the rules that you have to follow if you're trading a stock. If you're trading a stock, there's rules about when it clears and settles and who keeps track of it, the DTCC, and if it's a security, if a token is declared a security, none of that stuff works for the token. So there's a lot of stuff that has to be, first of all, you have to decide, do you like these tokens? Are they okay? Is the world okay with them? Then we got to figure out how to regulate them right, which involves the agencies, whichever agency has jurisdiction, which is going to be a fight to start with, but then they have to actually put the time and the effort in to develop the rules so these things actually can satisfy a set of rules, because in some cases the current ones just don't make sense, but there are a lot of aspects, I completely agree, of tokenized finance that do have characteristics like legacy financial products, banks, broker dealers, stock exchanges, all that kind of thing. I'll stop there.
Okay, so it'd be fair to say that like a lot of the questions are what existing laws and regulations make sense and what laws and regulations kind of just don't make sense or need to be modified or added on top of it. Would that be fair characterization?
Yes, and there's a lot of laws and regulations to look at to decide. And right now, there are at least two federal agencies, the CFTC and the SEC, who each would argue that they have jurisdiction and they're the ones that should look at the laws. So you have to settle that issue. And then you've got the Federal Reserve that has oversight over systemically important payment systems. So if a blockchain actually gains enough status that there's enough stuff trading over it, then the Fed could decide it's a systemically important payment system, and maybe it would want to regulate it. And then there's bankers who are at odds with stable coins because they're both trying to do transactions business, and there's money in the transactions business. So we have a lot of interests, butting heads here, arguing what's best for them, and the jurisdictions are cloudy, and the people in the Congress that oversee these agencies are on different committees, and their committees get power from the agencies they regulate, and so there's it's a big thing to figure out.
Yeah, no, and BPC, we've been trying to figure it out, and it's real complicated. It's not just federal agencies, there's state regulators, there's an international component. It's very, very complicated, to put it mildly.
Well, let me take one thing to add is taking it back to the consumer or the investor. So everything that was just laid out there is the individual who, frankly, is a tech-savvy person, and that is not me at the heart of this. But as you talk about the people that are building DeFi and want peer-to-peer exchange to be enabled, they're not people that are sitting here trying to figure out exactly which regulator they need to worry about. And the rules and not even just the rules, but guidance documents and best practices that would fill the room we're in and then some, as we know, with stacks of paper from floor to ceiling. So how are they supposed to figure out what it is they're supposed to do? And I think that's the birth of some of this as we've been talking about it, because you have people that are innovators. Some argue we wouldn't even have the internet if we were trying to start it up now, because the dynamics around all the barriers that we've put into place would really stifle that from happening. And so I completely agree. There are conflicts of interest, absolutely, among big players. That's why in any system you follow the money. Who's making money? Who are big entities? Let's actually go out and figure out what the rules need to be for those who are playing the intermediary role. 90% of the trading that is happening in centralized entities. That is point of fact and off-chain, because of, frankly, the scalability challenges of on-chain and being able to actually manage it all the way many envision it coming over time. It's not there yet. So you again get to this and the flexibility that we need to have. The system we have now, even in crypto, is not the system we ultimately envision and that many are trying to build. So it's a huge challenge from a regulatory standpoint to think about this. And when our vantage point is all current law, jurisdictional lines, and where certain players can stretch those lines too, that is a different conversation than what is the future of finance that we want to facilitate. So that's at least the angle I would add is that investor perspective. In addition to the fact that why are people building this as well, their desire to give better access than we've had in the past. To say certain certain products are only accessible by accredited investors. Why? Because they have $1 million to do it. So if you don't have $1 million, that means you aren't capable of engaging with those products or services. Is that what we're saying? So I think there are other ways and better ways to achieve some of the disclosures and to ensure that people are engaging with and understand the products that they're engaging with.
So Kathy, building off that, so what do you say? What is your advice as someone who does talk to people on the industry side who may not be as focused on the regulatory side or new to the regulatory side and policy side? What would you say to the industry in terms of how they should engage regulators and policymakers on these questions?
It is critically important. It's not for the faint of heart, though. I used to say this at the CFPB, too. We created a financial innovation office on purpose so that industry would have somewhere to go with people that are going to be a little more attuned to the issues that they're raising. I mean, it's completely understandable. When you have the products and services and responsibilities of each of these agencies in traditional finance, not every examiner is going to understand the crypto implications. So I feel for them, and we've got to do a better job of helping everyone raise their level in terms of understanding, because they will be engaging with this in the future for sure. But I really think that is an important aspect of things. And I know there are many entrepreneurs that avoided it. And that is unfortunate, because that also gets us to where we are today with trust and conversation. And you also have very skeptical regulators. And it's not like you're going in to change their mind. You're just going in to say, look, we have thought about the business. So I'm now talking about people that want to build a financial business. they're building a financial business, they're looking at the rules, they have advisors and lawyers telling them what applies to them, and they're coming in and presenting the business model and the plans and demonstrating that they have taken some effort to understand where they fit in that space and to understand the dynamics and trade-offs and risks and presenting that picture. And that's the conversation. Like, I loved having those conversations when I was in government. Like, it is eye-opening and important, and you see the nuance and issues that are raised by the ability to follow some of the rules, because some of them don't apply. Certainly some of the disclosures are not going to be possible for some of these products. But yet there may be another way to get at the fundamental issues, conflicts that Ty raised. That's what is the responsibility of businesses in this country. That's the way we set up the system. I just am concerned when you talk about, again, individual consumers, individual entrepreneurs, what they're building, what they want to put out to the world. I think there are a lot of ideas around safe harbor. And let's focus the federal agencies on the bulk of the activity that is definitely happening in a more centralized way. May go decentralized, we've got to be ready for that, but how can we create some kind of safe harbor to start building those things?
Thanks, Kathy. Ty or Paul, do you want to add anything to that, or Ty?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting thing, right? Because I would disagree a little bit with Paul. I would argue the federal securities laws are pretty clear. The standard we talk about is now twice as old as I am. And so one of the things I think we've seen, though, is just a deliberate, I would argue, indifference until very recently from the financial regulators who have authority. And I think in part because, hey, this is a new thing, we don't want to squash it. That's one nice way to think of it. Maybe it's, hey, this is something developing technology, developing businesses, let's let it grow. Another way would say, like, hey, there were folks who thought maybe this all collapses and we all go away and there's nothing to see here and then not our problem. We don't want to legitimize these things. That's another perspective I recall hearing a lot of 8-10 years ago. But I think we have to think about now where we are is we have a whole industry that's come, frankly, out of nowhere over a decade, and regulators who are now trying to figure out, wait, hang on a minute, I have a bunch of rules that probably apply here. We've done anti-money laundering before for people who move money from here to here, and you should probably know who you're moving money for. And we've done this across different agencies for a long time, and wait, now we should probably think out of how to apply that here. And so when we think about just regulation by enforcement as something we hear a lot of criticism of, and understandably so, we now have a situation where you have very obvious non-compliance with laws and various regulators, not just the SEC, but others, but a lack of enforcement for a period of years. And so now you have the question of, well, they're doing it. And I recall, not that long ago, Coinbase was considering, as a public company, was considering offering a product, and the CEO was very upset because the SEC essentially said, don't do it because that would be a security and then you'd be in deep trouble and have to register and do all these things. And that's a fair concern, understandably so. But his point, and I think well taken, was others seem to be doing the same thing. And so now we have this problem where if you're going to try to enforce the rules that may have existed for years but haven't been enforced thus far, what is a regulator to do? And particularly if you're a regulator who's now facing, or multiple regulators who are now facing members of Congress who are jumping in and saying, like, yeah, we don't agree with you, right? And so I think the biggest challenge we have is, as we're figuring out what the rules should look like, is also figuring out what the rules don't have to look like. But we don't have to rewrite everything. There's a lot of rules that can apply. They just really there are a lot of things that actually need to be updated to make applicable in those circumstances, right? Like anti-money laundering is a perfect one. Being able to track who's doing what is a really important one, but sales practices, conflicts of interest, custody, and she alluded to this just a moment ago, is when we talk about transactions occurring on-chain versus off-chain, a lot of people, when they buy a digital asset, buy Bitcoin or buy something else, they think that they own it. Technology or otherwise, they think that they own it. But do they own it? The question is, are they an entry into the chain that shows up on a clearing and settlement that says that they own it in the same they would with a security, or do they not? Do they instead have some form of, we could call it an IOU, you could call it a swap, you could call it a derivative, you could call it a lot of things, but do they have something else from an intermediary who may be in bulk putting that on a blockchain? And then the question is, what are the risks that they now have that they didn't know they had? They thought I owned Bitcoin, or they thought I owned some other digital asset. They didn't think, wait, hang on a minute, I have an IOU from an intermediary who may own this thing, and maybe hopefully has enough to pay me back in the profits or losses based on the value of that thing, or maybe not.
So to come back to the point, so I had an event at AI early October, had a bunch of senior policy people from many of the big players, FTX, Coinbase, and I asked a simple question. I said, say I'm a big company and I have traded stock on the stock exchange. I put out all the reports, the SEC, it's no problem. You can look up my stock price any time of day. And say I want to issue a new issue of stock that's tokenized. Can I do it? And they said, no, you can't do it. We tried. I think it was Coinbase. You can't do it under the current rules. So they have a management. They file all the management reports. They have all the accounting statements. They have all the disclosure. Why can't they do it? Because it's traded over the blockchain, and it doesn't clear and settle the way a security has to clear and settle under SEC rules. So
there are registered tokens. There are registered securities that are digital assets.
these guys claimed they couldn't do it. And
There are several. Well, that's the different question. There's a different question between whether or not they're registered
Repeat what he
securities.
just said, so I don't think people can hear.
Sorry.
But are they the ones, are they from a company that already does all the other annual reports and has traded stock? So there are people that issue new tokenized stock.
Okay, so for those of you watching virtually, audience member has mentioned that the stocks out there are not being bought, correct? Is that what you said? Okay, yeah. And
Yeah.
Paul and Ty are responding to that.
Yeah, so just a point. So you can actually register a digital asset. You can comply with the securities laws. The question, I think, as he pointed out, as the audience member pointed out, is that those don't happen to be traded. I guess my point is that's a different decision. That's an investor decision based on the disclosures, based on the trading, liquidity profile, and risk assets. Like, yes, there are also many, many, many publicly traded stocks that are also not heavily traded. And there are many others that make financial reports that aren't even publicly traded at all. You can look at OTC markets for
I
those types of
think Coinbase has a petition in with the SEC that actually mentions exactly this, that the clearing and settlement rules to trade stock are T+2 or whatever it is, and then you have to trade through DTC, and you have to use all these intermediaries to trade the ownership share of the stock. And my understanding is you can't do a registered security and trade it over the blockchain. Now, that shocked me, but I asked the policy people there, and they said, no, we looked into it. We were going to try it, and determined we couldn't do it under
Well,
SEC rules.
the current system locks in a lot of the intermediaries. I mean, you have to have a registered exchange and all of the dimensions around where this trading happens. I mean, that is part of this. We have baked all of this into the system. So it is not the way it's envisioned, and therefore you get to why would a Coinbase want to do this if they can't actually immediately utilize the technology that they're really here to support and build.
Yeah, I think for them and for others, I mean, if we hear the SEC chair, because I think he's been one of the most vocal on some of these things, he's really focused on the intermediaries, right? You notice how he hasn't gone out and said, hey, there are hundreds of thousands of securities out there. We're demanding that they all come in and register tomorrow. That isn't the conversation that they're having. The conversation they're having is, as it turns out under the federal securities laws, if you trade one security as an exchange, you have to now be a registered securities exchange. So it's a threshold of one. What he's basically saying is that you've more than triggered that, you digital exchanges and digital asset exchanges, and therefore we expect you to come in. Of course, the response has obviously been hostile. I would argue a little bit reluctant to do so. So one of the things I think we want to keep in mind is, while there may be assets that you can have registered securities that are digital assets, the challenge is anybody who wants to touch those things under the existing federal securities laws is now going to have to be registered and subject to those securities laws. Now, that means they have their own conflicts of interest. That means, for example, business continuity standards, right? That means they have to have the custody rules. That means they have to have all of the other things that go along in that. And frankly, in the digital asset industry, when you haven't largely had to comply and build your business around doing those things, largely, it's a lot cheaper. You can make a lot more money not having to do those things. Certainly have a lot fewer people.
It's certainly the case that the other side of the argument is that tokenized financial products are more convenient or maybe cheaper because they don't have to comply with all these things, and that is the counter argument. But it's not really. I think most of these the big U.S. intermediaries tell me they really would like to have a set of rules they could comply with, and they petition the SEC for it. But I think the future isn't just those intermediaries trading a dollar coin or it's the Web 3.0 and the smart contracts and the refrigerator you're going to buy 5 years from now that takes a picture of what's inside and compares it to the list of what you want in there, and it orders it out, because you're going to have some kind of currency you trade over the blockchain in order for that smart contract to work and get that groceries delivered, or else you're going to the grocery store. I mean, that's what these people think of as the future of the internet. There's no way any of these rules and regulations has any way to deal with these kinds of things now. But my understanding is that the people that are forward thinking are way beyond what we're arguing about now that doesn't comply. They think this is the way. Machines are going to talk to each other, automatically, order stuff that you want, pay for it with some kind of digital currency, because you can't use your MasterCard or Visa, apparently. I don't understand why you can't use your MasterCard and Visa.
They're working on it.
But they tell me that you can't, and you need a digital currency. But this is the vision of how we're all going to benefit somehow in the future. Now, I don't know whether it has to be tokenized. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but there seem to be a lot of people working in this direction, and you may deal a lot with them, Kathy. I'm not sure, but it seems like that's the way people want to go.
Being mindful of time and just getting audience ready for questions, I think I'm going to ask 2 or 3 more questions, then move to audience questions. So get ready with any questions you have. I want to change topics where we go too in the weeds around exchanges and some of the intermediaries. Let's talk stable coins. So Paul, this question's for you. What are stable coins, and what are the policy questions around stable coins?
Stable coins they come in 2 flavors. One flavor is you give them currency, you give them $1, and they say that they're going to turn that dollar into a tokenized asset you can trade over the blockchain. It's going to be their asset. It'll have a name. One kind of stablecoin says it's going to take your dollar and invest it in very liquid assets, so that it protects the value of your stablecoin. Some of these things, the stablecoin issuer will redeem them on demand. Some of them not. Some of them you have to trade on an exchange. There's another flavor of stablecoin that is an algorithmic stablecoin, which is like a program trading. It tries to maintain a dollar value. You give it $1, it takes your dollar and does whatever it wants with it, but it tries to trade crypto contracts to keep a dollar value, and those have blown up last May very famously and brought on the crypto winter. In Congress, people tend to be focusing on trying to pass legislation to make reserve-backed U.S. dollar stablecoins fit into the regulations in a better way so that they're safe. On the one hand, some people want to make them be banks and have like deposit insurance and all the examinations that banks have and community reinvestment acts, but I'm sure the stablecoin industry doesn't want that play. There's other senators who have introduced bills that just says, okay, your reserve has got to be invested in highly liquid stuff and it's got to be audited and you have to publicly put out your audit statement. So there's a whole variety of things here. Wyoming licenses, I think a couple states license stablecoins. I think New York and Wyoming and a few others are going that direction. So those are the ones that are, to my way of thinking, the ones that were likely to get some kind of resolution on where they fit in and how they fit in. They seem to be the most straightforward.
Yeah.
Overall, that, though, is this heavy over the head of stablecoins is the Federal Reserve, and are they going to issue a digital Federal Reserve currency, which would compete with stablecoins and
CBDCs.
yeah, central bank digital currency.
Yeah.
They're not going to be compatible. They're not necessarily going to trade on a blockchain like the other ones would, but that's a competitive issue here in the mix right now. So is that good enough?
Yeah, no, that's good. And actually, you mentioned sort of stable coins might be the one people are focusing on first, might be the easier part of the regulatory question, if I characterize it correctly, or maybe I mischaracterized.
But they're turning out not to be easy.
Be hard, yes. But they were at least
Yeah.
perceived to be the easier. Would you guys want to take sort of your take on it?
I'll start and turn it over. But I would say you mentioned something. It's like, someone hands you $1, and then the idea is that you now I'm going to be the stablecoin issuer. I can do something with it, and then I'll either give it back to you or I'll give it back to whoever you traded that to. That's great. There are a couple of businesses that sort of operate like that. We can think of banks, we can think of money funds, we can think of other things where you have entrusted me with your money, and hopefully I don't lose it, right? So the first thing is you worry about the reserves. Like, what do I do with your money? How safe is that? Is it, for example, a dollar deposit in a bank account? Is it invested in U.S. Treasuries? Is it invested in corporate bonds? Oh, wait, is it invested in commodities? These are all things that we're getting riskier and riskier and riskier. And as it turns out, the two largest stable coins have over time had dalliances in those riskier and riskier assets. And then the question is, like, how do we know that those things are actually that safe or not? Are they audited? Are those types of things? So that's one real set of questions, is if we're talking about the asset-backed stable coins, what are the assets? How risky are they? The next question is, whose are they? And I ask this question because this comes up with, and I'll just use a very example, a firm, one of the large stable coins, is talked about, actually, we're going to turn the reserves into and invest with a professional money manager as a money fund. So it'll be a government money fund. And you might think, wow, that's going to be really stable, secure assets or what have you. But they're investing it in their own name. So or you give me the money. And then the question is, if I turn around and invest it in my own name, and then I lose it, or perhaps I do something else and I go bankrupt for reasons totally unrelated, the question is, what's your right to the money? Are you a secured creditor for bankruptcy purposes or not? Not entirely clear. Kind of looks like not. And so when we think about asset-backed stablecoins, we have to think about not just are the reserves really there and how safe are they? Again, banking regulators do this a lot. The next question is, what are we talking about? Who owns it? And what's the custody of it? And I think that those are the challenges we're seeing. The Federal Reserve has one set of views. The SEC has a different set of views. Frankly, the states have different set of views. And when we look at a different stablecoin issuer, for example, they've taken an entirely different model of, hey, we're going to put these in trust, like a New York trust. That's a very different thing than saying it's in our name, held by somebody else and invested in other assets. Which of those ultimately gets approved or settled on? I don't know.
This is a big issue. In the original Libra Diem, which turned into Diem, you had no
The Facebook
one that's gone by the wayside. You had a Libra coin, but you had no claim on the assets. There were no claim. These are things that are important and they have to be worked out. But another thing on the horizon is if there were to be a blockchain tokenized dollar trading and that were to take off, banks can issue tokenized deposits. There's nothing in the law that stops a bank from turning a checking account into a tokenized account. And some of them have experimented with it internally. The thing that's stopping them is the regulators won't give them permission. There is nothing in the banks operate their own clearing and settlement system, their own ACH system. There is nothing in the law that stops them from creating a blockchain and tokenizing an insured deposit account and trading it over the blockchain. They haven't done it. They tell me that the regulators won't give them permission to, and they'd be willing to do it. And so so as soon as you get to the point where they're willing to tokenize this stuff, there's all kinds of things that can open up. And it could be a whole wild new world. You could have a tokenized checking account, and then you could have your regular checking account, and you could then order your groceries through your refrigerator smart.
There are so many challenges of terminology in this space. So that's I think one thing that we have worked on as an industry in terms of thinking about this, because we've imported a lot of language from financial services, but you're talking about people that don't actually know what those mean, using them in different ways. So certainly the concept of a stable coin, many of them, as we heard what was backing them, I would not call a stable coin. So again, you have the dimensions about this that are challenging. Fundamentally, though, it's really a means of an exchange that actually helps, again, create more interconnectedness for the ecosystem. So the stable coins are a key part of the infrastructure. And I think it will be interesting to see where this goes. It's not as easy as I think some thought, but I think it's an important part to tackle sooner rather than later. And there are certainly members that are trying to do that. And I think it is the right role for Congress to be stepping in, because this is well, yes, you could make some analogies to what exists today. This really is a key piece of the infrastructure to get right for the future that goes beyond finance, I guess is the key part I would make.
The law,
I'll let you make the last point, then we're going to turn to questions.
the law that stablecoins are authorized under state laws is the same law that's used to authorize traveler's checks. So you remember, Federal Express traveler's checks. They are not a deposit. They were never backed necessarily by anything. They were backed by the full faith and credit of American Express. People took them. So stablecoins are just something like that under that law that trades over a blockchain. The laws that govern current stablecoins in the United States under the states are the same ones that govern traveler's checks. And traveler's checks are not a deposit account. They're not insured, and people used them for years. So, I mean, they're not such a new. It's the blockchain part of it that makes it look like they're a new innovation. We've had private payment money orders, post office money orders, same thing. They're not guaranteed. I guess the post office one is a draw on the Treasury, but they're not so foreign to the system that we have now. They just look different. They look high tech, but they don't. They're probably again, all the issues you raise are right, but that's probably the easiest stuff to sort out, I think. Who owns stuff, how it works in bankruptcy, those are the easy questions.
Unfortunately, it isn't hammered out by the legislation I've seen thus far, and certainly not the existing rules. But
No, right.
Okay, yeah, let's turn to questions. So I do want to give you guys an opportunity to talk about existing legislation, regulations that you want to comment on, maybe in answering any questions we have. But okay, I see a gentleman over there. You have a question? Wait for a microphone to get to you first. And please identify yourself.
Hi, yes. So my name is Carlos. I actually work in DeFi. I've built DeFi protocols on Ethereum, work in data science or crypto. Great talk so far. I'm going to kind of ask for a comment on a thought. A lot of the people in the DeFi space, we hear you on the regulation, and what we're actually kind of hoping to hear sometimes is that there's a benchmark of, if you build it this exact perfect way, no intermediaries, no custody, the code will never change, blah, 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 then you're exempt from our rules. And then when you deviate from that, then you're in our rules. And I guess my comment is, like, do you think that'll ever be the case? Do you think that's a complete non-starter? Or do you think that we could get there?
Okay.
I guess I would say from the macro, it really comes back to what exactly you're building. Because if you're offering a financial product, that is fundamentally where you get caught up in most of what we're talking about and most of what's being talked about here. So that is a challenging thing to do, but there is a conversation around that, like I mentioned with the safe harbor. Certainly, SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce had a safe harbor proposal out that Congressman McHenry and a few others have been trying to play with, but it gets you to that space to innovate, and certainly that is, I think from my vantage point, important. It doesn't mean you're exempt from the rules, because you get back to, and I always go back to this too, there are laws against fraud. It's illegal. We don't need to deal with that through anything that we're talking about here. and it should be prosecuted, and it is criminally. I mean, you've got DOJs bringing cases. So that's, kind of with that threshold understanding. And there are a lot of discussions actually in, all of the channels that are out there that well, like Reddit and Discord and everywhere else, about some different kinds of, just best practices for code, and for putting that out there. And I will say a lot of that certainly lays out things. It's true that it hasn't been endorsed by a regulator, but some of this also gets to the enforcement posture that we were talking about in terms of how you go about something the right way, and at least then be transparent about that to the world when you create it and issue it. So I guess that's at least my initial response. I know others will say other things.
So one of the challenges, I think, that important challenge you raise is you're stuck in a bit of a tension between trying to promote the thing you're working on, and if it's tied to money at all, which can often be, you run the risk of trying to say, and I'll just use as an example, my Twitter feed is he followed is often I find folks who are saying there's no way that this thing can be a security. And then you go back and 3 tweets earlier or 3 tweets later, that same person is promoting their thing, saying, invest in us. There's going to be a great return. We're building this wonderful thing, and you're going to do great, right? Which is a thing you would see if you're a startup company promoting your company. And so if you're saying, on the one hand, we're not soliciting money and trying to build this thing with the money you're giving us and trying to give you some return, it really puts you in a bit of a bind. And that's one of the challenges where I think you could say, if you talk about safe harbors or what have you, this commission is this regulatory apparatus is unlikely to adopt a safe harbor. They're just not good at them. And historically, things like what we often call them regulatory sandboxes, they often tend to be beaches, right? Because either something swims out and goes into the ocean where it can survive for itself, or it just dies in the sand, right? And so one of the problems I have with regulatory sandboxes is it either really, really backfires, or it backfires in the opposite direction, where the thing has completely gone off and left the sandbox somewhere in the dust.
I argue that's an execution issue, but
but I hear your challenge. So from my perspective, I would say, and I hate to be the bearer of tough news, I don't think it's likely, largely because the tension that it puts you in is too often to say, I'm trying to build this thing, and if it's tied to money at all, then your promotion of building your thing and your ability to try to build it probably pulls you into the regulatory apparatus in some form or another.
A different way to say it, if you get a regulatory sandbox or safe harbor, if you blow up, it's over, right? That's the end of it. Not going to happen. If you don't blow up and you're successful and you achieve scale, they're going to regulate you. They're not going to let a lot of money flow into something that has no regulation. They're not going to let that happen. So it either blows up and forget about it, or you get scale and you're going to have to deal with the regulations a few years down the road. But maybe then you're making enough money, you hire the right lawyers, you get the right influencers, maybe you get the right regulation. I don't know. But so I think I completely agree with both of you.
Okay, we are at time, but given we started a few minutes late, I'm happy to take one more question, then wrap it up. It's between you two. I saw your hand first, so sorry. If your question is short, maybe you can both ask your questions, and then we can.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try to keep this short. Thank you, BPC and the panelists. I'm Gerald. I'm general counsel at a startup in the Web3 space. This question specifically, I guess, for Ty, something you said about SEC regulation, and I would love the other panelists to weigh in if we have time. I was curious, the notion that they're going after intermediaries, I think I kind of disagree with, just because you see very publicly announced sort of against a promoter, right, but not going against the issuer. There's also the very long litigation that they have against a particular issuer. Don't know if that's going super well for them, but there's also sort of the Coinbase insider trading case, right, where it's not even regulation by enforcement, it's sort of regulation through the back door, right? Because they in the action against that individual, sort of declared by happenstance 9 different coins securities, right? And so I'm wondering, if you could just talk a little bit about how are the battlegrounds being chosen? And why are the fights happening where they are? Because it seems like the ones that are highlighted are generally settlements, and we're not really seeing a lot of clarity on, it's the Howey test seems to have been reduced to promotion and advertisement, right? Like
Yeah.
in a management team. So
I appreciate it.
And real quick, is your
yeah.
question? Sure, you're good. Okay. All right. Go ahead, Ty.
All right. So really quick, if you want to know how they're prioritizing things, I suggest you ask Chair Gensler. He's over at 100 F Street, 10th floor, although I think he works from home most of the time. So regardless, I'll focus for my reading of the tea leaves of where I think, which is probably a safer space for me to be than to suggest I know what they're thinking. But I'll start with when so much of the trading is centralized, it's easier to focus. You rob a bank because that's where the money is. You want to regulate the digital asset industry, you go where most of it's trading. So that's one thing. So you're dealing with a handful of firms. We're also dealing with the chair of the SEC, who's very, very, very familiar both with financial services, as at Goldman Sachs, but also, frankly, from a regulatory perspective at the Treasury Department and the CFTC. In both circumstances, the chair of the SEC was able to call up a handful of very large financial intermediaries and say, I'm concerned, I would like you to meet me tomorrow at noon, bring your general counsel, we'll have a chat. Or pick up a phone call, because regulated entities, despite what we might hear in the press, have a tendency to respond to the regulators in a very, yes, we'll come right in. I say this as a former defense counsel, but the response is, yes, we'll come right in. We're concerned. You control our license. Yes, please. We're happy to meet with you. One of the challenges I think we've seen here, in part because of some of the turmoil in Congress, in part because of the press, in part because of the lack of enforcement and oversight for years leading up to now, is we have intermediaries who really are less than responsive to inquiries and less welcoming to inquiries. We saw a letter from several members of the United States House of Representatives, essentially to the chair of the SEC, telling him to buzz off with an investigation of intermediaries. That's not the type of thing you're used to seeing, right? And so one of the challenges, I think, as the commission is looking forward, it's impossible from a resources perspective to say they're going to look at all potential issuers. It's just physically impossible. They don't have the budget for it. So then the next question is, where can they focus their resources? So you focus the resources on things that are very obvious, high profile, and likely to make a splash. Sorry, Kim Kardashian. You think you're going to focus your resources on the intermediaries where you can get the largest bang for their frankly limited buck. Now, something I noticed is it only takes one security to trigger the intermediary status. And so what they did there is they basically said, look, I would expect, and I did this a few weeks ago, I would expect to see a series of very high profile enforcement actions related to a couple of those intermediaries based on the already public filings or reports of investigations. That's where I think this is headed. The only reason I don't think we're there already is largely a function of process. Typically, the SEC does investigations for years, settlement negotiations for another year or so, and then you settle it. And we're dealing with an industry that, unlike the traditional banking industry or unlike other large broker dealers or others that are repeat players, this is an existential threat to their existing business models. So they're not engaged in what I would call traditional response to regulatory investigations. Hence the litigation with Ripple as an issuer, but the same thing holds true with intermediaries.
But which I would just add very briefly, John, because we're
Good, yeah.
wrapping, is that should happen in the open. Settlement is the wrong way to go about developing rules that are going to be clear for market participants. So that's the fundamental issue with it, yes. And they're used to settling, and they're used to players that are clearly regulated by them, who of course want to settle with them and move on. So we've got a lot of rules that need to be established much more clearly for this market.
I too look forward to filed publicly contested cases, because then we'll all sort of figure out what the rule is.
Okay, I want to give Paul 30 seconds if he wants to give the last word, or we can just conclude it. Okay, so what I gathered from this conversation is that regulation is very complicated right now in this space. I think everyone would agree with that. We have this big debate around when existing rules are appropriate, when changes are necessary. And finally, there's a lot of work still to be done in this space, whether it's the Congress, the regulatory agencies, just think tanks doing sort of events on this. So that's my big takeaway. With that, I just want to thank everyone who's here participating. Thank you, panelists. I want to thank the people who made this event possible, like Michelle Kumar, Emily Burns, and our vendors. I want to thank the audience who's here and watching online. These events wouldn't be possible with you guys. With that, I want to wrap up the event and let you know we will be hosting one more event in this space with our partner, Humanity Forward, who also want to thank. And with that, thank you all for participating and coming. Bye.
Thank you all very much.